that locomotive with 200 or so cars, it does a great job. With that locomotive any other place, on any other railroad, it's just too much locomotive. The reason why the big boys weren't really built for any other railroads because no other railroad needed that type of locomotive. Some very large locomotives were built throughout the 1940s to rival it in size or speed or power or weight. They found out they might be too big, too fast, too powerful, or too heavy to run on the railroad that they were bought for. The diesel locomotives that we'll see at this end of the yard were meant for flexibility. So if a railroad needed more power, you connect them by electric plugs, and that way one man can control more locomotives. It was easier for the railroads to move the goods, but it also changed the whole complexion of the railroad. This railroad yard is a lot older than the big boy locomotive. That was built in 1941. This yard was built in 1851, and it was built for a completely different purpose. The managers of this railroad, the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, had big plans for this part of Pennsylvania. One plan was to open it up for settlement and industrial development. They did a great job. As they were bought the land, they had to cut down the trees, they had to blast their way through the stone, lay down track, and eventually start running trains. In 1856, they opened up a rail line to the New York harbor, and that helped the railroad to bring people into this area. It was so successful in its first few years, they figured, let's keep this thing going. They started building further west, and they didn't end their westward expansion until they reached the shores of Lake Erie in Buffalo, New York, completing at that time the shortest railroad route between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes, with the shortest route to the west. That brought a lot of prosperity for the railroad because new Americans, we might call immigrants, were coming in through New York looking for a quick way to settle into a new life in the new world. This was one of those quick ways to get there. Not everybody made it to the far west, though. A lot of people settled in a place like this because there were plenty of jobs to be found in America, and in this part of America, there were jobs to be found in mining, extracting hard coal from the ground and shipping it outbound all over the United States and even exporting it to other parts of the world. 80% of the world's supply of hard coal is found between that mountain range and the mountain range we're going to see when we cross over the bridge. The seams stretch up to Forest City, about 25 miles up north of us, and down south toward the capital of Harrisburg, and pretty much ends in a town called Dauphin, Pennsylvania. But that's where most of the hard coal can be found. There are about 8 other parts of the world, but they're in such small amounts that it really doesn't count the same way. But because there was such a high demand for moving the coal, the railroads had to build some monumental structures like the one we're traveling over. It's called Bridge 60, and it might not seem too monumental to you right now, unless you're on the edge looking straight down at the stones below us. Then they kind of get a different feeling for things. But the bridge became monumental because it wasn't just 3 or 4 tracks and a number of hand-thrown switches. It was 8 tracks next to one another, crisscrossing and joining up with one another, and 25 switches, all controlled by one man on the side of the bridge. There was no room for his tower, so they built it off to the edge. And in that tower on the 3rd floor, he pulled open and closed levers that would allow the tracks and signals to be set so he didn't stop any trains. He allowed the trains to cross without getting in each other's way. As we were clearing our own switches, our engineer is going to build up some speed. He has to prepare for our train to climb up a slight hill. The hill isn't a natural feature of the area. The railroad had to build it partly because they were so successful. If you're wondering how successful, the population of this area in 1850, before there was a railroad, was pretty low, about 600 or so people. By 1860, only 4 years after they opened up the rail line to New York, it was 10,000. And it kept growing. And with all these extra people crowding each other out on the unimproved roads, there wasn't enough time to take the dirt paths and pave them and widen them. They were all crossing the tracks where the tracks were originally laid on the dirt paths. So anyway, people were getting in the way of the trains from time to time, so the railroad took matters into their own hands by separating the tracks from the people, elevating the tracks above them on an earthen film. That dates back to the mid-1860s, and we are going to be on it as soon as we cross by the white X-shaped sign that says railroad crossing on the running right-hand side. Or do they take that sign down on me now? Oh no, there it is. From this 1860s elevation, kept the trains moving at a steady pace, so the mountains were no longer quite as steep or as much trouble to deal with, and also safely kept the trains moving on a regular schedule. The next big improvement took place around the early 1900s. When the railroad was preparing for our new train station to be built, they had to separate the higher speed passenger trains from the slower freight trains. We are on the freight track, so next to us they built a passenger main. Some of that main is taken away to make way for the mall at Steamtown, but another portion is still standing, as we see when we cross over South Washington Avenue. You see how the tracks come to a bit of an abrupt stop when they reach the road. A track or two might still remain on that portion of the concrete wall they call the China Wall, but they don't go anywhere. They don't come from anywhere. It became overgrown since the last passenger train through town was in 1970. This part was unused. Only last year did they start clearing out the trees and weeds and reclaim it and turn it into a city park. Another portion of the main we'll see when we cross over Cedar Avenue, and we'll see that that is now a parking lot because the train station is now a hotel.